Welcome. My name is Cameron Miller, and I'm coming to you from Trinity Place in Geneva, New York. And this sermon is based on the lessons, the readings for Proper 13, Year A in the Revised Common Lectionary, or 9 Pentecost if you want to look those up. But it's basically using Matthew's Gospel of the feeding of 5,000, which leads me to ask, what is it about bread? Most of you who hear or read this sermon have access to varieties and quantities of food that those peasants in Matthew's story never dreamed of tasting. Even now, when the pandemic and inept federal response to help states find and manage resources, and when there are indeed food shortages because of poor distribution and the absence of moral will, our general level of caloric intake is pounds and pounds and pounds greater than the peasants at Jesus' side. So here's a fascinating, at least one that I found fascinating, reading. It's an image that we're given about Galilee in Jesus' days from an article entitled Poverty in the First Century Galilee. It goes like this. The poverty in Galilee is also reflected by the fact that almost no remains of storage buildings or grain or other products have been found in archaeological excavations in Galilee, and no shops at all. The Galileans seem to have consumed all they produced, having paid the rents and taxes and loan remissions and interest. There simply was nothing left to trade with. It brings to mind the image of people in a life raft consuming anything that they find to eat or drink as soon as they find it and can get it. But most of us, you and I, have food in the pantry or the refrigerator, the freezer. We know how and where to get more food if we need it. Bread to those folks in Jesus' day was the primary source of calories, ravenously eaten as soon as it was gotten. We fret about carbs. But does anything smell better than bread baking in the oven? And the act of kneading bread, it's both sensual and practical and laborious. And the mystery of yeast, though not a mystery really, is still fascinating. And what about butter melting into the porous surface of toast? Oh, bread. The mouths of the lavishly rich and the painfully poor all welcome bread, which, though seldom observed, is what the story in Matthew is about. Now, whether by intention and design or not, the folks that put the lectionary together left out half of Matthew's story. My suspicion is it's because they wanted us to focus on Matthew's story as a miracle story. But for Matthew, anyway, as he told it and as he edited his gospel, this is not a miracle story. This bread story is political commentary and economic and social criticism. Now, wait a minute. In case your reaction to that news is suspicion and resistance because you don't like the sounds of it ideologically, or you prefer your Jesus without politics, cut me a little slack here. Give me just a few minutes to explain why this looks like social commentary more than a miracle story. I understand why there might be some resistance, because whenever the story has been told, only half of it's been included. So today's reading, as you'll see from the lectionary, begins this way. It says, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew in a boat to a deserted place all by himself." Now, if we didn't get so fascinated with the feeding of the 5,000, we might otherwise ask ourselves, heard what? Now, when Jesus heard this, He withdrew in a boat to a deserted place. Heard what? This story properly begins far from a boat, far away from hungry peasants, far away on the other side of the lake. Matthew's version, anyway, of this feeding story begins where Herod lives, King Herod the Great. It begins with King Herod's birthday party. As we might guess, it's an opulent feast and the pluperfect opposite of Jesus' feast. At Herod's feast, there is the heavy aroma of lamb sizzling on the spit. There's seasoned duck and pheasants, maybe. Even soft, steaming bread with wonderful flavors to dip it into. There's juicy, succulent fruits and wine, lots and lots and lots of wine. At Herod's feast, they eat while reclining on pillows. At Herod's feast, there's music. At Herod's feast, there's dancing. In fact, at Herod's feast, there's a special dance performance, a sensual dance with youthful bodies schooled in the art of seduction. Herod, the subplot tells us, is smitten with one of the dancers. Smitten might be too wholesome of a word. He is engorged with lust for the dancer that is his teenage stepdaughter. Herod becomes senseless with craving as she dances. His hunger rides on the horse of his affluence, galloping out of control. She dances and he falls prey to his obsession. Keep dancing, he begs as the music stops. Keep dancing and I'll give you anything you want. Anything, gold, power, palaces, slaves. What makes you happy? None of that, she says. Cut off the head of John the Baptist and serve it to me on a platter. I know, right? How did John the Baptist get into this crazy story? Well, John the Baptist was another prophet and social critic, more renowned in Jesus' day than Jesus was. He was already in prison because he had been a severe critic of Herod and because he had crossed the line with his moral finger-wagging. So, long story short, an entourage of kitchen slaves arrives carrying a large, handsome silver platter. Ceremoniously, they make their way through the feasting crowd and place the human head, its eyes wide open, its lips curled in a gruesome, crooked grimace. Truth written all over that face. And they set it at the table before the king. Jesus hears that story about John's beheading, and immediately he leaves for a deserted place, which I take to mean that he got the heck out of wherever he was and went into hiding. Now, when Jesus heard this, Matthew tells the story of the first feast, and then immediately he tells about the second feast. Was Jesus freaked out and afraid? Was he grievous for the loss of a friend? Does he immediately recognize that the punchline of Herod's action is that those with power do not give it away, or those who own affluence will not soon part with it? Now, in my imagination, it's both. Jesus was in grief, and he made a strategic retreat to consider his options. But Jesus is followed. Jesus is followed by a crowd. Without a helicopter, without a horse, without even a bicycle, Jesus can't get away from the crowd. It's kind of funny. We never thought about Jesus running, have we? the people who follow Jesus are hungry. They're hungry. Now remember, they consume everything they have all the time because they don't have any extra. People like that don't have hope very often either. They can't afford hope. But for whatever reasons, and let's be honest, we're not sure all the reasons, Jesus inspires hope. Jesus is followed by people who are hungry for food and who are hungry for hope. Thus comes the story of the second feast. At Jesus' feast, there's no music. At Jesus' feast, there's no protein. There's no fish in Matthew's story. That comes much later in John's story. At Jesus' feast, there's no wine. At Jesus' feast, there's no pillows. At Jesus' feast, there's no dancing. At Jesus' feast, there's only bread. Bread. At Jesus' feast, the host shares what he has and acts as though it will be enough, even though he doesn't know whether or not it actually will be enough. At Jesus' feast, there is no affluence, as there was at Herod's feast, but there is at Jesus' feast abundance. And right there is the fulcrum upon which this tale of two feasts balances. Affluence is what we have when we own wealth and resources. When we own wealth and resources. Abundance is what we have when we have more than enough. You get that? We can have more than enough and not be affluent. And we can be affluent and not have abundance. That's the social commentary of this gospel, by the way. The one I said was not about a miracle. An economy based on abundance ensures that everybody has enough. Whether no one is wealthy or some are wealthy, everyone still has enough. Abundance is the invisible hand that guides the economy of God. And that is the tale of what the tale of two feasts is about. The primary narrative of Herod's economy, and in fact ours, I'm afraid, is that we should own more than we need and accumulate as much as we can, even if such affluence offers no abundance. Our economy is guided by an invisible hand of natural selection, and it grabs as much as it can. And so in our economy, it's built on the principle of scarcity, so that affluence is shared by only a few and abundance, more than enough, is impossible, because in affluence there is never enough, no matter how much we have. The social commentary of this gospel is that affluence deepens our hunger, affluence deepens our desires, affluence deepens and seduces us with promises of more and more and more and more. Abundance, on the other hand, abundance ensures that we have enough, even more than enough. No matter how much or how little we have relative to everybody else, it's enough. An economy of abundance may include people with wealth, but it does not allow anyone to suffer significant deprivation. So the moral of these two feasts, which are one story really, is that affluence leads to jealousy and anxiety and violence, while abundance leads to generosity and empowerment and community. But let's not promote or live in fantasy. We don't get to decide which economy we live in. They're both side by side, as if straddling two dimensions at one and the same time. We live in our economy even as we might desire to live in the economy of God. Which means that our spiritual task, our baptismal ministry, really, is to release ourselves as much as possible from the seductive power of affluence and nurture in ourselves and nurture in one another the hope and the work of abundance. You see, as I read it, the tale of two feasts in Matthew is not a miracle story. Rather, it's about us and about which economy we will thrive in. That seems like a life-saving reminder in the midst of pandemic and in the midst of political and social crisis. You and I individually, we cannot change the facts on the ground, but we can choose to live by and follow abundance rather than scarcity. It may feel risky for us to do so because everybody around us is shouting, "Scarcity!" But I invite us instead to intentionally, and with all the spiritual strength and imaginative muscle that we have, to shape the lens of our abundance and look through and live by that. Peace be with you. And really, thank you for listening.